After a minimum wage boost for some baristas and staff at one local coffee shop, a new policy added managers to their tip pool. Joining us today is Alex Lucifero, employment lawyer, to break it down for us. Good morning, Alex.
Good morning, Stefan.
Generally, let's just go over what are the rules around tipping and tipping out here in Ontario.
Sure. I mean, nothing controversial or overly complicated about it. Tips are wages, tips are income, so an employer has to pay them out. They can't keep them for themselves. Employees are rightfully owed that money. Employers do have the ability to decide when those tips are paid out. So depending on the industry, of course, could be nightly, could be weekly, could be bi-weekly based on your payroll.
Right.
But again, it's income. It's wages earned by those employees. They have a right to them, and that's really that.
Traditionally, we haven't seen people in management roles collect tips. Usually they're responsible for handling the money and helping to tip folks out. And we're now starting to hear different stories where managers are being brought into the tipping pool. Immediately, it feels like a conflict of interest, but are there any rules being broken around that?
Well, there are certainly rules around that particular point, Stefan. So it's important that these employers are following those rules. And the basic rule is as follows. If, as a manager, you're going to be receiving tips, you effectively have to be doing the same work that those employees are doing that also receive the tips. So if Bridgehead is now saying, managers, you're now being included in the tips, well, guess what? That comes with an obligation. Those managers have to be on the floor, have to be serving coffee, have to be cleaning tables, etc. If that's not the case, then that employer is going to be in trouble. Managers shouldn't be receiving tips. By law, managers shouldn't be receiving tips if they're not doing that kind of work.
We should mention that Bridgehead did not respond to us or CTV for comment, but that is where the story stems from. If you are an employee and you feel that there is a conflict of interest taking place, and perhaps this manager is not doing the same work, or maybe scheduling themselves to do more work so that they can earn more tips than the people they're managing, how do you go about reporting that?
Yeah, it's probably the most important question here. Here's where things get interesting, in my opinion, Stefan. So it's important to remember an employer can't implement a policy like this that is going to dramatically negatively affect employees' pay. So this is what we call a constructive dismissal situation in employment law. So if these employees, for the reason you just mentioned, if a manager is taking over particular hours so that they increase their tip recovery, if those other employees' pays are being dramatically negatively, of course, affected, that might be a constructive dismissal situation where the employee can say, no, I'm not agreeing to this. The employer has to either back away and say, okay, fine, we'll find a way to make this work. Or alternatively, Stefan, those employees can potentially treat their employment as terminated and obtain severance. That's what a constructive dismissal situation gives you. It's a potential right to severance, or alternatively, and this would be my suggestion if there are any disputes about this, listen, employees should be speaking to their employers, and employers should be playing ball. You don't want to be negatively affecting your employees. It's going to decrease morale. You're going to have a terrible work environment if you're basically taking money away from your employees. It's not the right thing to do.
But even then, some of that word choice that you mentioned is subjective in nature. Dramatically and negatively, for me, could mean something different to the employer. So even then, you're still at odds and having to maybe duke it out.
And there is always going to be a gray zone there where, well, what's a significant change or what's a substantial change? And listen, employees should be receiving some advice perhaps in those circumstances if they feel as though the change is significant enough. If your pay is changing by a couple of bucks a week, I think you got to just kind of let that one go, right? But if it's any more significant than that, certainly those employees would have rights and protections under the law.
All right. Alex, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and expertise.